The smoke hung low in the summer air. The sun had barely crested the ridges of the Montana plains, and already the sky was thick with heat and dust. Bodies lay scattered across the slopes above the Little Bighorn River, some face down, some staring up at nothing. Horses screamed in the distance, blood soaked the trampled grass, and in the middle of it all, near the crest of a hill that would later bear his name, lay a man in buckskin, an arrow in his ribs, 2 gunshots to the chest, pale eyes staring skyward, George Armstrong Custer. He had died as he had lived, charging into battle, certain of his own brilliance, blind to the storm he'd provoked. But to understand what happened that June morning in 1876, you have to go back, before the gunfire, before the glory, before the myth. You have to understand the betrayal. Years earlier, the United States had signed the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 with several Plains tribes, including the Lakota Sioux. It established the Great Sioux Reservation and, critically, recognized the Black Hills of Dakota Territory as exclusive Lakota land. But that treaty meant little once gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Prospectors flooded in. The government turned a blind eye. When the Lakota resisted, defending the sacred ground of their ancestors, Washington labeled them hostiles. By 1876, the U.S. Army had one goal: force the Lakota and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies back onto reservations, whether they agreed or not. Custer was eager to help. He wasn't just any officer, he was a celebrity. A flamboyant Civil War general known for his long blonde hair, his flashy uniforms, and his appetite for attention. Newspapers had dubbed him the Boy General. He'd built his reputation on reckless charges and dramatic victories. But he was also controversial, prone to disobeying orders, obsessed with glory, and not above brutality. In 1868, he'd led the 7th Cavalry in an attack on a Cheyenne village at the Washita River in Indian Territory. It was pitched as a military success, but many of the dead were women and children. Some had been chased down in the snow, others executed in their teepees. Custer called it a necessary blow. Others called it a massacre. Still, he remained a favored tool of the U.S. Army. And in the spring of 1876, he was assigned to a 3-pronged campaign meant to corner the hostiles in southeastern Montana. General Alfred Terry would lead the main force. Colonel John Gibbon would approach from the west, and Custer's 7th Cavalry would strike from the south. They assumed the tribes would flee or surrender. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that Sitting Bull, a Lakota holy man and chief, had already seen what was coming. In a Sundance ritual weeks earlier, he had fallen into a trance and had a vision: soldiers falling into camp like grasshoppers from the sky. The tribes were ready. Thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered near the Little Bighorn River. Warriors, women, elders, children, a community on the move, bound by a shared need to defend their way of life. By late June, it was the largest native encampment ever assembled on the northern plains, possibly 7,000 people, with over 1,500 warriors. And Custer had no idea. On the morning of June 25, 1876, he and his 600 men approached the area. He'd been warned by scouts that the village was large, very large, but he didn't believe it. He was convinced the native forces would scatter if attacked swiftly, so instead of waiting for reinforcements, he split his regiment into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno would attack from the south, Captain Frederick Benteen would scout the left flank, and Custer himself would swing north, attacking the village's rear. It was a decision born of confidence and ignorance. Reno's charge was the first to meet the full fury of the native defense. He was quickly overwhelmed and forced to retreat into a thicket, where his men took heavy losses. Benteen's group, caught between chaos and confusion, never reached Custer. Custer rode on, into the teeth of an army he couldn't see. When his battalion crested the ridges above the Little Bighorn, they saw the vast encampment stretched before them. But it wasn't fear that greeted them. It was resistance. Warriors swarmed out of the village. On horseback with rifles, bows, and war clubs, they converged on Custer's 210 men. Some came from Sitting Bull's camp. Others were led by famed war chiefs like Crazy Horse and Gall. They weren't running. They were hunting. Custer tried to hold the ridge lines. Some of his men dismounted and formed skirmish lines. Others huddled behind rocks. But the warriors knew the land. They moved fast, struck hard, and showed no mercy. The firefight was over in less than an hour. Eyewitnesses from the native side said it was a whirlwind of screams and gunfire. Some soldiers tried to break out. Others shot their horses to use as cover. A few were believed to have taken their own lives when escape became impossible. By the time it ended, every one of Custer's men was dead. They found his body 2 days later, stripped of its uniform, riddled with bullets. He hadn't been scalped. Some say out of respect, others say contempt. His expression, they said, was peaceful. The Battle of the Little Bighorn stunned the nation. In the East, it was called Custer's Last Stand. He was hailed as a fallen hero, a brave soldier overwhelmed by savage hordes. Newspapers romanticized the defeat. Paintings showed him in martyr's pose, pistol in each hand, hair flowing in the wind. But the truth was far more complicated. Custer wasn't a martyr. He was a man who had led his troops into a battle he didn't understand, against people he didn't respect, on land he had no right to conquer. The tribes had won the battle, but they knew what would come next. The U.S. government, humiliated, responded with fury. More troops poured into the West. The Black Hills were seized outright. Within a year, most of the leaders from Little Bighorn had surrendered or been killed. The reservation system grew tighter, more violent, more complete. The victory had cost them everything. Sitting Bull fled to Canada for a time, but was eventually forced to return and was later killed by Indian police. Crazy Horse was stabbed to death while in custody. The freedom they fought to preserve was swallowed up by barbed wire, railroads, and broken treaties. And Custer? His legacy became legend. Schools were named after him, monuments erected. His widow, Libby Custer, spent the rest of her life shaping public opinion, casting him as noble, brave, and misunderstood. But history has not been kind to that version of events. Modern historians see Custer more clearly now, as a man of ambition and recklessness, as a tool of conquest, as someone who brought death not just upon himself, but upon the many soldiers who followed him, and the countless native families who suffered in the aftermath. The hill where he fell is now part of the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. There are markers for the soldiers who died there. But there are also markers now for the native warriors who fought and fell, not as villains, but as defenders of their homes. And perhaps that's the real story. Not the fall of a general chasing glory, but the last great moment of native unity, when the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho stood together and said no more. They did not win the war, but in that moment, they made history stop and listen. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.